Good evening, everyone. We are very excited to be here today to learn more about the work of the OECD in Latin America, and specifically within the Development Center. The first part of this conference will be dedicated to the recently published Latin America Economic Outlook 2022. And in the other half, we'll look at the careers within the OECD. First of all, I would like to thank all of you attending the conference, both in person and via Zoom. I would like to thank our panelists also, who have very kindly accepted our offer to join us this evening. This conference is a collaboration between the Political Observatory of Latin America and the Caribbean, PALC, and the Abya, which is the Latin American Association for SciencePo. The event will be moderated by myself, representing the PALC, and Ellen Roberts, representing Abya Paris. Before we begin, I'm going to briefly introduce our guests. First, we have with us Sebastián Nieto Parra, head of the Latin American and Caribbean Unit, also known as LAC, and current professor at SciencePo Paris. Laura Gutierrez, junior policy analyst, also at LAC Unit. Olivia Cuq, policy analyst at the LAC Unit. And also we have Adriana Caicedo, policy analyst at the LAC Unit. And we have to remark that we have all our guests coming from the alumni SciencePo.
And Cristina.
And Cristina Cabutto, I'm sorry. Cristina Cabutto also coming from the LAC Unit. Now we'll proceed with some introductory words given by Mr. Nieto, Sebastián Nieto, followed by a Latin American Economic Outlook presentation. And thank you so much. I'll hand the floor to Sebastián.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. So that's a pleasure to be here with you and to present what we are doing at the Development Center, and in particular on LAC. Just before talking about the work that we do on LAC, let me share with you some slides about the work that we are doing at the Development Center and what's the purpose of this department, how it fits in the OECD galaxy, and at the end to show you the experience that we have at the OECD. All of us are from SciencePo. We are still working together with SciencePo. We studied SciencePo. We are now, that's my case, but for the others, we are really following what we do at SciencePo. In my case, I'm a teacher as well at the Paris School of International Affairs. And so we have a good relationship with the organization, with SciencePo, and so this is just an example of the different partnerships that we have, and we are going to show you during the discussion today what we have done at the OECD with Latin America. But as I said at the beginning, we have a strong relationship with the academics, and in particular with SciencePo. So the OECD Development Center, so this is, if you can go to the next slide, we have a different galaxy than what we have at the OECD in terms of the membership. So we have an establishment in which the creation was to connect better the emerging economies and developing countries with the OECD. And that was created, but actually the former President Kennedy in '61, with the idea at the end of how the standards that you have at the developing countries can be expanded to the emerging world. So that was the words that he pronounced in Ottawa, in Canada, to the Parliament when he proposed the creation of the Development Center in '61. So now we are going to celebrate the 60-year anniversary this year, because last year the COVID was quite complicated. So we are going to do a great celebration. So we are going to inform you about this, and of course you are more than welcome to this celebration that are going to take place in the second half of this year. Just to highlight, if we can go to the next slide, that one of the main purposes that we have at the Development Center is to have an equal footing dialogue between all countries at all income levels. So this is something that is really important. So we have a governing board at the Development Center in which we have OECD countries, but at the same time we have non-OECD countries. And one of the main important aspects that we have in our philosophy is to have an equal footing dialogue, dependently on the level of income that we have. We have as well the importance to share experiences about the best practices in public policies. And last but not least, to discuss how we can transfer technologies and to transfer knowledge in the context of the agenda that we have at the Development Center. Something that is closely related to the development and transition approach that we have at the Development Center. That's something that we worked for Latin America with the LAC, with the European Commission. Actually, Adriana, she's working on this, on the DIT. I mean, this is the acronym, the Development and Transition approach that we do with emerging economies. So this is really important because this is an approach that goes beyond the traditional official aid to emerging economies. That is just, you have this package of money and you have to spend on this. Now here, the idea is, okay, let's discuss together how to spend that money that we have from the developed world to the emerging economies. It's an equal footing dialogue and a demand-driven approach that is needed today for the development, and we insist a lot on this approach. If we can go to the next slide, we have at the end 53 members at the Development Center. As I said before, we have OECD and non-OECD countries. And in particular, for the case of Latin America, we have 14 countries. So just to sum up, in the case of Latin America, you have 4 LAC OECD countries. So we have Mexico, Chile, Colombia, and most recently Costa Rica. Now we have 3 countries, Argentina, Brazil, and Peru, that they're going to start the accession process quite soon. That's something to be defined with these countries. And then, in addition to these 7 countries, we have other 7 countries that are members to the OECD Development Center as well. That's the case of Uruguay, that's the case of Dominican Republic, the case of Panama, the case of El Salvador, Guatemala, and others. So we have at the end 14 countries, so we have the majority in terms of representation when we talk about the emerging world. Certainly, as I said before, so we have a huge number of OECD economies as well that are members of the Development Center. And at the end of the day, we have a governing board in which the countries sit down together to decide the agenda that we are going to work at the Development Center and to share experiences on what we are doing. So we have for this a mutual learning group in which we discuss some of the country analysis that we do. And as in the other departments at the OECD, we have a peer learning discussion in which you have some countries that are going to comment their policies on the basis on what we are studying for each economies at the OECD Development Center. Something to highlight on the governing board as well is that we do specific discussions on development. Just to give you an example, last week on last Friday, we had the president of Costa Rica, Alvarado, to discuss with us the experiences that he had as a leader in the region in terms of green policies, fiscal policies, and at the end, how we need to work together. So there was a good example of the initiatives that we have at the Development Center to discuss on policies and how to share with other organizations as well. So, as I said, we have 53 countries, but our work goes beyond. We have sometimes other countries that are covered. That's the case, for instance, on taxes. We have a huge work on taxes in which we are covering, for the case of Latin America, other economies. That's the case, for instance, of Cuba. That's the case of Bolivia, other countries that are not members of the Development Center, but we cover in our statistics. So that's why we said that we engage with more than 80 countries, and certainly with international organizations. So this is a key principle that we have, never alone. It's important to have a coherent discussion with countries. And in the case of Latin America, we work closely with the IDB, with the LAC, with CAF, that's the Development Bank of Latin America, and certainly with other organizations that are globally based, but with an important focus on Latin America. That's the case of the World Bank, the IMF, and certainly the European Commission. So that's in a nutshell what we are doing at the Development Center. We leave the floor to our colleagues, Olivia, and then Laura, Cristina, Adriana, that they're gonna present the outlook. But then before presenting the outlook, Olivia can go more in detail on the contents on the agenda that we have at the Development Center. So please, Olivia.
Thank you. So following what Sebastián was saying, in the Development Center, we are more than 100 people that on the staff. And I guess this is one of your first questions, how do you become staff? So one thing you have to know is that all of us working there, we are either nationals from a member country of the OECD or nationals from the countries that are in the governing board of the Development Center that Sebastián was just explaining. So that's the two main requisites in terms of nationality. The staff is varied. We have specialists in gender, in inequality, in macroeconomics, trades, green transition, among many others. And the main point we have in common, of course, is that we are all working to make sure that countries can reach their sustainable development goals in their own way, helping them to reach that point. And specifically into what we do, what does this staff, this varied expert staff do? Well, if we take a look in the impact of the pandemic, we, as you all, I'm sure, already know, the socioeconomic impact of the pandemic has been severe and will remain like that for a long time. All the progress achieved over the last decades, especially in terms of poverty reduction, is at risk of being reversed, and in some cases has already reversed. So what we are identifying, it's a looming multi-speed scenario in which certain countries like much of Asia or the most advanced economies are already regaining their pre-pandemic indexes of, for example, per capita index income. But it's not at all the reality of Middle East, Africa, and Latin America and the Caribbean, where these rates are expected to be reached in 2023, 2024, or even the next millennium. So this is the first scenario. Second scenario, it's climate change, because while governments were handling with the pandemic, climate change did not stop. So what the 2021 showed us, highest temperatures, ice melting in the Antarctica, but also in Antarctica, unprecedented costs in terms of weather disasters. And as you, again, I'm sure you already know, the impacts of climate change hit harder on developing countries, and especially on the vulnerable groups of the south corner. So it also combines with the fact that it's where we have less financing tools and where we insurance for this kind of disasters is less typical. So this poses a double challenge to the policymakers, which in the next slide, we can see that in developing countries, it's even more challenging. For example, with the example of climate change, imagine you are trying to do what's right. You are trying to switch from fossil fuels to renewable energy. Well, in the short term, probably you're going to face a rise in consumer price. You're going to face lower income for the fossil producers, which is going to take you to lose export revenues. So how do you do it? How can policy makers face this scenario? Well, I'm sure you must guessed it by now, but policies. And we believe that it's through the innovative policies that you can face this kind of wicked problems. But of course, the Development Center doesn't have the right questions, the right answers for all of these questions. But we do believe that the path to it is through adapted solutions, adapted policies to the particularities of each country, specific solutions to the nature of the problem, and co-created policies. Co-created not only among the members of the Development Center, but also with local actors, private sector, civil society organizations, as many as stakeholders as possible. So one of the deliverables we have are the regional flagships. We have annual flagships reports on Africa, Asia, and Latin America and the Caribbean. And as what brings us together today is Latin America, we're going to talk a little bit about how the links between the region and the organization have grown. As Sebastián was saying, we have 2 new members that joined the organization, Colombia and Costa Rica, while Chile and Mexico were already a part of it. And Argentina, Brazil, and Peru are applying their accession process, which we know it's going to take a while, but already shows how the bridges are being put between the region and the organization. And that is also the role of the Development Center. As Sebastián was saying, we have 14 of Latin American countries in our organization. So that allowed them wider space for their voice, but also it allowed us to comprehend better the realities and particularities. The main example of these strong relationships is, without doubt, the Latin American Economic Outlook. As I was saying, this is an annual report, and even though we have one per year, we push ourselves to make sure this is an innovative report that brings forward main challenges facing the region, and which coincides with the demand-driven characteristics Sebastián was saying. We make sure that all of the topics included are those demanded by our member countries. And of course, we don't do it alone. We do it through strategic alliances with our main partners that Sebastián just mentioned. And last but not least, this is not just a report. LALIO has become a platform of dialogue, which as we are here today talking with you, we try to include as many actors throughout the process. While we're writing it, with experts, open up our drafts, we re-question ourselves, and we make sure that indeed we are trying to be as specific as possible. And for example, last year we came up with a report our colleagues are going to explain now. So I'm going to hand it over to Laura. Thank you.
So, let me change it. So as Olivia was saying, we're going to make a brief summary of our Latin American economic outlook.
Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Because we can move, I mean.
It's good?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, we're gonna present a brief summary of the Latin American economic outlook. Last year, we focused on working together for a better recovery. You can change. So our report is gonna be structured, it was structured in this manner. First, we talked about the socioeconomic impact of COVID-19 crisis in Latin America. Then we established what governments do or what they should do in terms of addressing those socioeconomic implications that the pandemic had. And of course, fiscal policy is key for the short-term recovery, but also for addressing the debt that we have with society, which is to strengthen the social protection systems that, of course, are the support to the most vulnerable groups during the pandemic. And also there's a problem that has taken a toll in growth in the region, which is a drop in productivity. And it is key for this regional integration as a catalyst for productive transformation. So how are we going to do this? At the end, we came up with rethinking a new social contract that brings together stakeholders from all sectors of the city and involves them in decision-making processes, and also to resort to the important role of a renewed international cooperation that supports and helps finance for development. So let's start first by the impact of the pandemic. So as you saw, Latin America was one of the most affected regions. We had 1/3 of the world's deaths in COVID. So of course, this had a great impact on one hand. And on the other hand, we had a deep recession of output growth, of output worldwide growth. And we had a 7% contraction in 2020, and even though last year some economies recovered, the GDP per capita levels will not come back to their pre-crisis levels before 2022, 2023. And this is due in part to lacking in some sectors, including the tourism sector, but not only that, also issues related with productivity, which we'll address further on. Of course, as we just mentioned, the most vulnerable were the most affected. Extreme poverty levels dropped to numbers that we hadn't seen in a decade. But with the recovery, total poverty levels decreased, and also middle income classes regain some of their income, but the most important is that extreme poverty continues to increase, and this is due in part to the rising levels of informality, but also to the lack of protection of the social protection systems. So as we can see, the extreme poverty rates continued to increase last year as compared to the total poverty levels. The reduction, the poverty reduction process had initiated 20 years ago, stagnated in 2015, and this is due in part to the low productivity we have been mentioning, and we're going to talk further on about this. So of course, what governments did to address this crisis, governments put into motion fiscal measures and monetary measures very swiftly and in large amount, which of course helped a lot in the recovery. They had to get a little bit creative. Most of the countries didn't have an formal employment insurance, and so they had to resort to databases of the conditional cash transfer systems in order to get this money through the vulnerable groups. And so this was a way a little bit to contain the deterioration of the situation. Next. So one of the most vulnerable groups that was affected, of course, were the informal workers. Informality in Latin America is a large part of total employment. Of total employment. As you can see, 40% of informal workers lack a social insurance and a main social assistance scheme, and this, of course, has a deep effect on how they could get the resources from these fiscal measures and these monetary measures that the governments put into motion, because they were left out from the social safety nets. So of course they were the most affected. And with the crisis, of course, and with the fiscal measures and monetary measures that were put into motion, there's a depletion of the fiscal space, which of course was already limited with the financial crisis and with the commodity boom, the end of the commodity boom in 2015. So of course, what we present now is a limited fiscal space, and we have to address the next crisis with this limited fiscal space, which of course needs to be restored. And as we can see, countries resorted to increasing debt levels developing the domestic markets to address this indebtedness, but also to reduce the exposure to the volatility of exchange rates. And of course, market conditions are changing. And because of this, it's very important to restore fiscal sustainability and to be able to address the changes that we want to create social protection systems, because we cannot further finance this through indebtedness, but because it's not sustainable. So our proposal, next slide, please, is to focus on tax collection in Latin America, more importantly, the total tax revenue as a percentage of GDP. OECD levels are very much higher than the ones in Latin America. As we can see, this go as low as Guatemala with 13% and as high as 33% in some southern countries. But what we see here is that there is an ample opportunity and ample potential for countries to increase their tax revenue collection. Their tax revenue collection specifically for countries in Central America and in the Andean region, and specifically Mexico, for example. And what we propose is not just efficiency in the terms of increasing tax collection, but also changing the composition of these two more progressive tax system. For example, in Latin America, increasing the personal income tax would be a more progressive system, more progressive tax than just relying on VAT taxes, which tend to be more regressive. So to improve the situation in Latin America, and with an outlook to improve the situation, of course, the progressiveness in tax system is essential, but for that we need effective communication. Of course, fiscal policy is going to be key in supporting the growth, supporting the recovery. And for this, I mean, of course, nobody likes to be taxed. So what we need to come up with is a good sequencing and a good effective communication that can be backed by a broad consensus by society. And of course, international coordination is key to address specifically the cases of high debt level, or the countries that have high debt levels, and also to address the issues of fiscal sustainability and to renegotiate the debt. So now my colleague Adriana is going to continue.
Thank you, Laura. So now let me get into the impact of the COVID pandemic more into the micro level, so at the households. So what was one of the channels through which the COVID pandemic mainly affected households? It was, of course, through school closures. As we see in this graph, school closures have been 70% longer in Latin America than in the OECD countries. Of course, this was an important measure that all countries had to take back in 2020 to make sure that social distancing measures were possible. But this also means a challenge both for students and also for parents at home. It also means that it has exacerbated inequalities in Latin America, both in access to education and quality education. It reflects, of course, governments' difficulties to face the pandemic, both in having deployment of vaccination schemes, but also difficulties for social distancing measures within schools on time. Important gaps in access to technologies and digital tools, have, of course, exacerbated inequalities, because in Latin America, as we know, is very different if you are in a rural area than if you are in a city where you have access to good quality internet. Of course, it's not the same if you're an informal settling. And so this, of course, is a challenge, and it also affects, it has also affected, of course, parents that have informal work jobs, as Laura was suggesting before. As we know, in Latin America, more than half of workers have an informal job, which means that they cannot rely, of course, on employment benefits for facing the pandemic. So this takes me to the next point, which is, of course, social protection mechanisms and social assistance program, which were expanded during the pandemic. A lot of governments, take the previous slides. We can see that we have the list here, but I mean, most Latin American countries actually did an effort to expand social protection mechanisms through mainly two different approaches. Horizontal approach means creating new programs that benefits non-covered citizens or increasing the coverage of existing programs, or through the vertical approach, which is increasing benefits to those already covered. Basically, before the pandemic, governments in Latin America had targeted some citizens that were under the poverty line. So these are citizens that are already in the databases of the government and they know where they are, who they are. However, we have a big chunk of the population that is the vulnerable population that is not as poor to be targeted in those programs, but not as rich to have to be in a middle class. So this vulnerable population was the one that actually was facing the most risk to fall back into poverty, and of course is what we are seeing today with the reversal in the poverty indexes in the region. This is, of course, the reason why it is important that at the unit of analysis in these countries for social assistance programs is the households, because it allows us to really see the multiple dimensions through which an external shock like the COVID pandemic affects the household. So through education, through children, through parents that are informal workers. And of course, and as we can see in this graph, almost 70% of Latin Americans live in an informal or a mixed household, meaning that one of the parents or the head of the household holds an informal job. Next slide. And one of the main groups that were affected by the pandemic was, of course, women, because they hold most of the caring activities at home, but also women were part of the activities and the sectors that were mostly affected by the pandemic, including, for instance, the services, the commerce or tourism. So, of course, as we can see here, women, with respect to men, had a much important impact in employment rates. And then finally, now to turn more to a more macro level, of course, disruptions because of the pandemic did not only occur at the household level, but also in the trade and productive systems throughout the region. As we can see here, more to the right, we can see that the share of intra-regional exports in Latin America has been decreasing for the past decade. This, of course, is an important challenge. At present, it's only 13% of the share of intra-regional exports. This is only to say, of course, where are the main opportunities for the region to improve the competitiveness and productivity. And those sectors are basically pharmaceuticals, automotive sectors, sustainable agriculture, where the region can have and can improve productivity and have more formal jobs by improving regional integration and regional exports. As we can see, we have a higher intra-regional flows. So there is also an opportunity to improve exports beyond Latin America.
Thank you. Let me know if there is a problem with the microphone. So this is the final section, don't worry. It won't last much longer. So in this final section, we're especially going to look at the domestic and also international elements that could help achieve some of the policy proposals that have been put forth during these presentations by my colleagues, Adriana and Laura. And especially in order to achieve a recovery that is not only sustainable, but is also inclusive and fair. And for this, of course, what we see and what we say is that the region and governments in the region should take the opportunity of the recovery to work more with citizens, engage with them, and really put their well-being and their needs at the center of the recovery strategies to design a new social contract together. Why is this needed? Well, because we have seen that even before the pandemic hit, the region was already experiencing rising social unrest and also decreasing levels of trust in public institutions. We have seen that in the protests in Chile, but also in Colombia, Guatemala, and more recently in Peru, just to name a few. And we also see it, for instance, in this figure where we see the decreasing satisfaction with public services. We also see how satisfaction with education decreased steeply, especially during the pandemic, probably also due to the long school closures, much longer than in OECD countries, as Adriana was mentioning. So this brings us really to the need for working together with citizens to regain also their trust, to advance towards this new social contract that can also help implement some of the key reforms that are needed in the region. So next slide, please. So what do we mean by this? Of course, the social contract can be quite an abstract term. Well, in this table, you can see some of the policy proposals that were already put forward in this presentation that make up what can be called the building blocks of a renewed contract for the region. Of course, we know that the region is very heterogeneous and countries are facing different challenges and have different priorities. So what we're talking about is not a new constitutional process as is happening in Chile. It can also be more limited initiatives to achieve specific agreements in some of these areas. And of course, three important areas of interventions are of course, regional productive strategies to stimulate productivity, but also strengthening of social protection systems, and of course, sustainable finance as a key element to sustain the recovery efforts. But we also take an intersectional approach to adapt these strategies to the different needs of different socioeconomic groups, different territories and regions across countries. We know that there are differences even within countries and also across generations. So what this means is, for instance, that it is important, for instance, to manage debt in a sustainable manner, not only to avoid future debt crisis, but also to ensure that also future generations will have access to financing at sustainable rates. Another example can be, for instance, how we can learn from the innovative social assistance programs that were implemented during the pandemic to strengthen social protection systems and adapt them to the needs of specific socioeconomic groups, such as informal workers. These were the main building blocks, but we also know that the process itself should not be underestimated. And what you may have studied also in your political economy classes is that these reform processes are very complex. because they involve different actors that may have different interests, time horizons, and also different levels of economic and political power. So what we identify are 4 elements that we believe can help ensure that these policy reforms reach a broad and also long-lasting consensus. So first element is, of course, the importance of inclusion and participation. This means that all the key stakeholders should be at the negotiating table since the beginning. And this is, of course, important because it helps conciliate different interests, but it can also help to create coalitions of different actors that can sustain the reform process even beyond the short-term political cycle or the duration of a specific government. A second element is, of course, the importance to adapt the speed and the scale of a reform to the specific socio-political context. For instance, at the moment, we are seeing how citizens, but also businesses, are still recovering from the negative effects of the crisis. So in the short term, governments may want to avoid increasing tax rates and instead explore other policy options to strengthen public finances, such as increasing the fight against tax evasion. A third element is, of course, also the importance of taking into account specific compensation mechanisms that can help mitigate some of the negative distributional effects that these reforms may have, especially on vulnerable groups. And of course, a fourth element is the importance of information and also of communication throughout the process. This means that governments should not only engage in the provision of objective and reliable information, but also engage in effective communication strategies so that all citizens can understand the costs, but also the benefits of specific reforms. And this is, of course, especially important to ensure that they can engage in a meaningful manner in the reform process, especially also given the rising levels of misinformation that we are observing. But all of these elements are also important to overcome some of the barriers to implementation, such as fragmentation in the political arena, the risk of policy capture. And of course, it is also important to continue to invest in capacity building to ensure that these policies are then effectively implemented on the ground. And the last point that we also mentioned is, of course, the importance of framing these strategies into long-term national development plans, which are planning tools that governments can use to align actions and ensure a long-term coherent vision and action plan. So I'm concluding now, don't worry. We have so far talked about the domestic dimension of working together for a better recovery, which is the title of the report. But of course, all of the increasing transboundary phenomena that we are observing, from climate change to the digital transformation, migration, and also the supply of vaccine, also raises the need for a new type and a renewed type of international cooperation. And in this context, as Sebastián was already mentioning, the OECD Development Center has been working since 2019 on a different framework for international cooperation that we call development in transition. What this means is a new approach to international cooperation with a multidimensional perspective to inform project design and implementation, but also new forms of cooperation, new tools and new actors. We're talking about, for example, mission-driven partnerships, a renewed regional cooperation, so that LAC countries can also speak with one strengthened voice in the international arena. And of course, different tools such as South-South cooperation, triangular cooperation, and in general, as we were mentioning, a new multilateralism in which, of course, all countries can speak, can participate in policy dialogues and fora on an equal footing. Okay, let me stop here, as I think we have already covered quite a lot of material. I think we have now a Q&A session, so we can maybe expand a bit more on some of these topics. Just please remember that this is a conversation, so, well, you can ask about the work of the OECD, the Development Center, and the outlook more in particular, but we also want to hear your thoughts and your potential contribution and insights for our work. So don't be shy, and thank you for the attention.